Hey folks, and welcome to my build guide for Exsanguinate Reap Miner for patch 327. This is an update to a build I've league started a couple times now very successfully, and will be a safe bet as a starter again, even with the change to Trickster, or maybe could play as an Elementalist, but there are pros and cons to that I'll get into a little bit later in the video. There were also some substantial buffs, and I'm going to change how I level the build thanks to a huge buff to Pyroclast Mines. Another thing I love about this build is that there are ways to squeeze out extra damage that PoE won't show you, and I'll share with you how I'm doing that in this video. Feel free to hop around. I'm going to leave chapters in the description. Okay, the first and most important thing in my opinion in the build guide is to discuss how the build feels to play. Exsanguinate as a skill is an S tier mapper. The way it works is you pay a portion of your life to shoot tendrils of blood instantly across the screen to around 10 mobs and many more if you have chains. These tendrils have 0 travel duration, automated targeting thanks to mines, and instantly reach their targets, resulting in screen-wide clear. And because this is also a cold conversion build, the instant nature of the hits and chains mean we get screen-wide freeze, which is one of the best mapping defensive layers in the game. This build is also a miner to work around some of the downsides of Exsanguinate, one of which is a hefty casting time of 0.8 seconds and having to manually aim. Mines enable us to pay the casting cost after the skill goes off, and automation and detonate mines can trigger them in flight as soon as we press the skill. Mines also provide substantial additional scaling vectors that can be pushed with investment into hundreds of millions of DPS. These things combined make for a very comfortable mapping experience. Now, Exsanguinate by itself can be scaled up to be a bosser, but if we do a gem swap to Reap, we have access to up to 180% more damage. These two skills scale in exactly the same way, which makes them interchangeable. Reap is a similar skill in that you pay life to deal damage. However, with Reap, you materialize a blood sight, which does damage in an arc in front of you instead of blood tendrils. And with Reap, you acquire something called a blood charge. And each of these charges provides 20% more damage for a grand total of 9 with Vaal Reap, or 180% more. And if we combine that with the 200% increased charge duration we get from Tytykiller, we get 30 seconds of uptime before we need to reacquire them. Now it's worth mentioning that the dot portions of Exsanguinate and Reap were both buffed again this patch for the second time in a row, but because I play this as a cold conversion setup, it does very little for our damage. This build is also very SSF friendly, and you can do almost all content with just a couple cheap tier 5 uniques. Now, every build has downsides, and this one is no different. The first is that I am using a gem swap for pinnacle bosses. You don't need to do this for map bosses and most content, and above a certain level you can drop Reap entirely if you want, but until you have an endgame setup, you're probably going to want to run Reap for pinnacles like Maven and Uber Elder. The next is that the build is reliant on freeze as a defensive layer. The build has a relatively low EHP, though you'll find that the actual survivability in-game when mapping is quite high. Now, Trickster has some of the best defensive kit in the game, and if you want to make a Giga Tank Trickster Exsanguinate build, you definitely can do that. It's just not the direction I'm choosing to take it. Lastly, I'm using Minefield in this build, because it is an absurd amount of additional damage and the strongest support available to miners. The way it works is, when you throw a mine, if there is more than one, you have to pay an additional throw cost per mine in the sequence. Minefield allows us to throw up to 5 at a time, which as you can imagine is a ton of damage. Now all that said, if you hate Minefield, you can trade it for Swift Assembly, which is still very good and actually will improve your throw time, though you'll lose some damage. The next thing to answer is what type of content will this build excel at, and the answer is most of it. It's an exceptional mapper, and I expect it to excel at the new Breach 2.0, just like it crushed Breach last league. If you're into Legion, this is going to be one of the best Legion farming builds. Same thing with Essences, Harbingers, Betrayal, Alva, etc. Pretty much if you need to kill a lot of things, this fits the bill. It's also going to be good at bossing strategies like Destructive Play, Guardians, Ubers, and if you are an experienced player, you can use it for carry service, which I expect to be very big this league with the new Bloodline Ascendencies requiring boss kills. Now, some things I don't think this build is going to be good for are Delve, Simulacrum, though if you invest enough you can actually do Simulacrum because freeze in Simulacrum is amazing. And if you want to do Lab, you might want to rework parts of it around specifically how fast you are. You can also do Juice T16s and 17s with this build, however recognize that it's going to take a similar investment in your character, right? Because you need freeze, you need to be freezing things, so if you juice things to be like say 5 times as hard, you're going to need enough investment that you can still reliably freeze. Now, before we get more into the meat and potatoes of the build, let's talk a little bit about the patch notes. There are 2 Trickster nerfs that affect this build and 1 global nerf. One step ahead was changed from 108% action speed base down to 90%. This means that it's no longer good for leveling, and it's less good for T17s and Valdos, which is fine, honestly. I only really use it to get through campaign and early maps faster before respecking into Spellbreaker. The pre-nerf version of One Step Ahead was a bricked ascendancy once you equipped an Archon's tools, which I highly recommend you do, and I'll talk about how later. So this isn't really a big deal outside of day 1 and 2 in my opinion. The second nerf that Trickster took is the loss of 20% suppress from Spellbreaker. This means that now you have to acquire some suppression on gear in order to cap it. Spellbreaker was also buffed to provide 15% less damage taken instead of 10% while on full energy shield. However, it coincided with a global nerf to suppression as a whole by 10%. Losing 10% suppressed damage is the moral equivalent of taking 20% more damage, but it's important to point out that this affects all classes. Realistically, it just means that you're going to have slightly higher gearing requirements before you go into Ubers, and Spellbreaker is still going to be the best mitigation available, and Trickster is still the only one with Spellbreaker. For Uber bossing content, I'm probably still going to take Spellbreaker, however, this could also be used as 2 Ascendancy points to take a Bloodline. One massive buff we received this patch is the new Runegraft of Refraction. This grants all skills +1 chain, with the downside of skills only firing a maximum of 1 projectile, with all of them also forking. Now, if we look carefully at the skill card for Exsanguinate, you'll notice the word projectile appears on it exactly 0 times, meaning the downside doesn't apply to us. Instead, we get +1 chain for free. Normally, you'd have to decide between running chain in your links or a damage support like Awaken Cold Pen or Trap and Mine damage, but now you kind of get both. +1 chain is more than enough for very, very comfortable clear, and you get to run 6 damage links. There's also substantial power available in the graphs that we'll have to wait for data mines to really make best use of them. Okay, let's get into how the build works. Exsanguinate is a spell skill where you pay life to shoot tendrils at targets which travel and hit instantly. These tendrils, importantly, are not actually projectiles and cannot be modified by projectile behaviors. However, the skill does carry the chain tag, which means it supports like Awakened Chain and the new Runegraft do apply. Exsanguinate in this build is linked to a mine support, which enables a very powerful auto-targeting mechanism and also causes it to reserve life until the mine has reached the end of its lifetime. Because it reserves life, you'll need to source some life regen in sufficient quantity to pay the cost. Now, we do this early with a very cheap unique called Kikazaru, and later we'll do it with flat life regen on our gear, or maybe with Vitality. Reap is a similar skill in that you pay a life cost, which reserves it. However, instead of tendrils, it materializes a blood scythe, which sweeps in an arc where it's been cast. Now, as a skill, Reap does slightly less base damage than Exsanguinate. However, it gets something called blood charges. Each blood charge grants 20% more damage to Reap for a default maximum of 5 charges, or 100% more damage, vastly outpacing Exsanguinate. To acquire blood charges for ourselves, we're going to have a 2-link level 1 Vaal Reap linked with Arcanist brand. And when you drop this on the ground, it will start casting the low level Reap, which obviously isn't going to kill anything, and you will accrue these blood charges yourself. Now, if you're ever curious, you can always look up on the buff bar to see how many blood charges you have, though sometimes the pinnacle boss's health bars will cover them, which is kind of annoying. Vaal Reap is an important part of our maximum damage output. It's a special version of Reach which works slightly differently. Once it fills up with souls, you can hit it to instantly gain up to your maximum blood charges. No Arcanist brand necessary. On top of that, you get an 8-second buff called Boiling Blood, which gives you another 4 blood charges for a total of 9 and 180% more damage. Now, once Boiling Blood falls off, you still get to keep 5 of the charges for the remaining 30 seconds. Note that for Reap, when you have blood charges, your life costs will go up, so make sure you have enough life regen to cover it, or a life flask handy. Now, for Ascendency Choice, I still think Trickster is the best option. If I weren't playing Trickster, however, I would play it as an Elementalist. The upside for Elementalist is obviously Liege and Golems. You get flat life regen, some melee damage reduction, some crit chance and AoE. Stone Golems are also particularly awesome because they aggro mobs, and having an elemental damage immune decoy golem is pretty amazing. You get better generic defense, particularly for physical damage from the Elementalist Ascendancy with Shaper of Flames. You get DR from Shaper of Winter and Bastion, which are probably the nodes I would take outside of Liege. I don't think Heart of Destruction is worth a foy pointer. That's probably the best candidate for a Forbidden Flame and Flesh set, but they are going to cost a fortune in this league. The downsides for Elementalist are going to be an enormous amount of socket pressure. Losing 4 sockets to Golems on a build that's tight with sockets feels terrible. You're probably giving up quality of life like a 3-link movement skill, maybe Bear Trap, and not only that, to really make best use of miners in 327, you probably want to use Archon's tools, which I'd highly recommend, and you want a 3-link or 4-link skitterbots to effectively scale their ailments. Now, you're also losing Swiftkiller, which triples your charge uptime. For an Elementalist, the charge mastery then is now a non-negotiable take to get 100% charge uptime. And you could drop Reap and just go mapping, which would save another 2 sockets if you want to be pure Exsanguinate build, which is how I would probably play it. You're also probably not stacking Primordial Bonds, as this damage scales better with physical scaling investments, so some of the Golem utility is muted. Now, Trickster's upside is about 40% more damage from the 2 Frenzies and Polymath, and Escape Artist, which makes it the best evasion and energy shield kit in the game. Now, if you're going to do Uber bosses, Spellbreaker is like 26 or 27% less damage taken while in full energy shield, which is difficult to beat for 2 Ascendency points. Though I have to say, losing the 20% suppress means it would be an easy candidate for a Bloodline Ascendancy. Trickster also doesn't suffer as much from the socket pressure, which makes Reap difficult to play as an Elementalist. Lastly, Trickster has much better Forbidden Flame and Flesh options, and Assassin got massive buffs, which means Trickster indirectly got some buffs. That said, I think Elementalist would be a fine choice and was my backup if they completely dumpster Trickster, but the nerfs feel pretty mild since I don't care about Leech. Now, how to play the build. If you are going to do mostly mapping, what I would do is probably put chain your links until you can get the Rune Graft, and then trade those chain links out for Trap and Mind damage or Awaken Cold Penetration. It's pretty simple. You run around, you push the button. It's a 1-button build in maps. When you're bossing, however, you want to do a couple things. Now, the only gem you actually have to swap is Reap for Exsanguinate. I don't personally use Chain or Awaken Chain in Exsanguinate because honestly, I'd rather have the damage support like Trap and Mine, and I'm expecting to have the Rune Graft of Reflection this league. Now, the way it works is like this. You're going to throw a Bear Trap or 2 at the boss's feet before it phases in. Then wait until about a second before the boss is about to phase in and drop an Arcanist brand at their feet. Now, there's some breakpoints here that I'm going to talk about in a later section. Feel free to skip there if you want, but don't throw the brand too early is the TLDR. Now you're going to spam Reap, and if Vaal Reap comes up, hit it. Generally speaking, that's about it. Not much was going to survive this. You also have the option for conditional damage, like Focus DD, which I personally love, or maybe self-casting a curse if you want to have a balance of terror. But those are extra buttons and not 100% necessary unless you're really trying to max out your damage. This patch, I'm planning on leveling as a Pyroclast Miner. I did a full campaign run into red maps with it using the much weaker 326 version, and honestly, it felt pretty great. In 327, the skill, when used as intended, is an actual skill instead of a flat damage support, and will get a 35% damage buff, a lower projectile requirement, meaning you get more of them, and a free fire exposure as a mine aura. The thing the skill lost was the added flat damage per mine aura. There is a longer-winded explanation for why it's better than the old version, but I'll save you that and say that the new version is much more suited to Automation Detonate Mines playstyle and should be a considerable damage buff for those who play it that way, which is how I intend to do it. Pyroclast Mines require a very small respec as you level as a Spell Miner, which is a big improvement over the Attack Miner to Spell Miner swap I did last league, and should be a little more new player friendly. My friend PoE did a run and recorded a lot of it, which is whose footage I'm using right here. Thanks for the help since I failed to record my campaign. I'm also doing something a bit different with this build guide, and let me know in the comments if you like it or if I should do more of it or less of it. For each level, there is now a gem change or milestone written out in the notes, and I've highlighted the change necessary at the level. I find this a lot easier to read and follow along with than using the pull downs in the skill section, so I don't know, the skill section's still there, but I think this is a little easier to follow. Off the beach, I'm using Cobra Lash to get to level 4, and then I'm switching into Rolling Magma. Now, Rolling Magma feels terrible to play without cast speed, and thankfully they buffed Arcane Surge in 326 to provide 20% cast speed and 30% increased mana regen at all levels. This means level 1. Now, what I'd recommend doing is keep a level 1 Arcane Surge linked to Frostblink and never level it. It will proc constantly and you'll get the cast speed buff, making Rolling Magma feel much better. Now, it's also not everybody's cup of tea. PoE recommended trying to level as Explosive Trap, which is another option. Now, I've leveled many characters as Explosive Trap, and I personally like Rolling Magma a bit better since they nerfed it several leagues ago, but I recognize there isn't an objectively better option. It's mostly personal preference. Do what skill you like the best. If you want notes on how PoE leveled his through level 31, he's posted a link in my Discord. A quick run through of what I plan on doing. I'm going to go over to Elemental Focus first. This makes Brutus a bit easier if you start with it. And then I'm going to come down to Coordination. Coordination gives cast speed and attack speed. This will both make you faster and cause you to do more damage and make Rolling Magma feel a bit better to play. This one, in my opinion, is sort of non-negotiable. Coming up here, I'm going to take more damage through Snowforge, some defense, and I would take Mind Drinker first, and then you're going to come over to Explosive Elements as you transition into Pyroclast Mines. Now you're going to do the transition at level 31 because that's when you can run the library and get charged mines. I also think the Mind Mastery for life regen is the best in campaign, and the RMR feels really nice because you're going to want to pick up Grace to go with Skitterbots. After that, you can start taking some of the crit wheels. These will improve your damage, even though you're not going to be anywhere near crit capped. And I also thought Blast Waves felt really nice. It's an AoE skill, so the AoE does benefit, and you get 30% increased damage, which is pretty good early on. The rest is life, and then we're going to start taking more crit nodes. Doomcast is really great. You're a Spell Mine build. And I think this mastery in particular is very nice in campaign. That 150% increased crit strike chance goes a long way, especially for map clear. Now, once you do second lab, you're going to take Polymath, and I would respec these 4 points right here and take some masteries because each of these masteries now boosts your damage. Note that because we're a mine build, we don't get the recovery, but the damage boost is pretty healthy. Now, as we continue on, we're going to do a little more crit, and we're going to start caring about suppression. I think entering maps, suppression actually feels really, really good, particularly when your gear is still kind of scuffed. Suppression can go a long way to making mapping feel better. I'm going to take this crit wheel and a frenzy, and then I'm going to move into these life nodes here. These evasion life nodes are great, and we're going to have to go all the way over to charisma anyway to be able to run hatred once we move to Exsanguinate and reap. Now, once you get to maps, there are some great uniques. I guess you could find them a little earlier if you want, but these are going to vastly improve your campaign experience. March of the Legion in particular gives between 3 and 5 gem levels to Pyroclast Mines because it's aura tagged, and the Divine Blessing doesn't affect it in any way. It's not supported by that. So this is a pseudo extra link that you can have, and you could take this all the way into red maps. Worm Sign is another very common 5-link item, although it will reduce your clear sum with Pyroclast Mines because it has conk effect. There are also some very common chests that are great defensively when you're in maps early before you roll your own like large necrotic armor. Kintsugi gives a ton of straight reduced damage and a lot of evasion. In fact, it was buff last patch, and Restless Ward is fantastic. Once you've sourced endurance charges, it will give you a lot of flat life regen to offset Exsanguinate and Reap later. But even without that, it gives you a lot of additional move speed, which will improve your mapping progression. These are the things I'm going to be looking for on League Start. Somewhere around level 80, I think, is the right place to transition. Now, I've tested the transition at level 65, 70, 75, 80, and what it boils down to for me is that when I have a 5-link, I have a Hrimsaro, I have a Kikuzaru, and I have enough nodes that I'm reasonably high crit chance. So something like 70% is pretty good. And in order to get there, you really need support from your tree. I've left sort of a checklist of where I want to be for the transition from Pyroclast Mines to Exsanguinate. It should be a very simple transition because they're both Spell Mine builds and the trees are pretty similar. The things I want are 5-link, ideally a level 18 Exsanguinate, though the quality doesn't matter. And really importantly, I want to make sure I have the correct spell modifiers on my gear. So +1 physical gems and not fire. Ideally, I would have a +1 gen item in each of the weapon slots or a shield and weapon and on my amulet. Spell crit chance is also important. Crits give you free freeze, and the more of that you can get, the better. Now, as soon as I transition, I'm also going to come over and take Winter's Embrace. I've left notes about all of that in here. Feel free to reference this if you have any questions. All right, let's take a quick look at gear. So this wand is super basic. It is an Essence of Scorn recombined with a +1 level of physical spell gems. Now you can get a +1 Fizz wand or rune dagger if you like, or scepter, by vendoring 40% combined quality skill gems that are physical tagged with a scoured weapon of a base of your choice. You'll have to do that maybe 2 or 3 times in order to recombine these successfully. And then I've just benched mind throwing speed. You can also multi-mod and get something like spell damage and damages extra chaos. But for super basic purposes, this is great. I'm doing a similar thing with my chest. The chest piece is probably the most important, particularly for Trickster. You'd pick up and scour bases from your maps and then alt spam for flat evasion and energy shield and the hybrid increased evasion and energy shield and stun recovery. Once you've recombined these 2 mods together, you can bench increased evasion and energy shield to get almost 3k evasion and almost 600 energy shield, which is kind of insane. I'm using the unique Hrimsaro and Kikuzaru. Both of these are super common. And otherwise, this is life and res gear. Also, highly recommend as soon as you get to maps, get an Essence of Zeal and use it on a decent base. This could be a Stygian or a Crystal or a Heavy Belt or whatever. But essencing for trap and mind throwing speed on a belt is a substantial damage boost, and it costs almost nothing to do. I'm also using a single medium cluster here. These are really easy to roll. Expert Sabotage and Guerrilla Tactics. Guerrilla Tactics is the best in slot mod, and Expert Sabotage is speed tagged. The rest of these jewels are just 2 props. They're just sort of to get us into endgame. There are actually a lot of much higher value unique jewels we could use, like a Lethal Pride, a Balance of Terror with Elemental Weakness, and on and on. Now, I'm not going to get too much into endgame gearing in this video. However, there are 2 very powerful uniques that I'm expecting to be pretty readily available on League Start that I want to discuss here, and those are the Heatshiver and Archon's tools. Heatshiver, most of you probably know about already, but if you are reliably freezing mobs, it becomes an enormous damage boost, and this build wants it for obvious reasons. I didn't include it here in the League Start PoB, but I will have a more endgame focused PoB that's fully kitted out with better gear and a Heatshiver in the description below, all the way up to probably a couple 100 million DPS. Heatshiver is an important part of that progression into big damage, and this unique will be one of the first things I acquire opening weekend. It usually costs a decent amount on start, maybe a div or 2, which can be a lot, day 1, and it will get cheaper later in the week. The second and more impactful unique I'd like to discuss is Archon's tools. This unique belt was introduced in 3.26 as a drop from the normal version of the Incarnation of Neglect, and it interacts in interesting ways with your skitterbots, providing a means to almost double your damage if you can mitigate the downsides. Now, for obvious reasons, this is where we want to take the build. And if you're curious about how exactly it works, I've done a longer video detailing the mechanics. I'll link that in the description. And the more endgame focused PoBs in the description of this video will all be using it. Now, one important consideration when you're setting up your skills is should you use Lifetap or not? Now, one of the nice things about Reap and Exsanguinate is that they cost and reserve life, so the mana you can completely push to auras. Now, you have to have enough headroom to actually cast the skills you want, like your movement skill, your curse, so keep that in mind. Lifetap is an option, or you need to have enough reserve that you can actually cast all your skills. Now, one really important thing, and this is the first breakpoint I'm going to talk about, is faster casting on Arcanist Brand and Reap. If we tick and untick it, it gives us 0 damage. However, there is an important numeric breakpoint that you must hit if you want to have 5 blood charges up when you're bossing. By default, with no modifiers to duration, Arcanist Brand exists for 5 seconds and can be attached for 3 seconds. Now, turning it on and off, you'll see that it dramatically affects the trigger rate. And by proxy, this is a big boost to your damage. You want 5 blood charges, and the only way to get it without having to recast Arcanist Brand is to improve your cast speed. Now, you can get it on gear, you do something else, but I found that just linking faster casting was the easiest and most reliable way to do this. Without it, you're looking at a 20% damage loss. I'll demonstrate that here. Both of these kills were identical, except with one I had faster casting on and one I had faster casting off. Now, for the second really important breakpoint that is not obvious, I did a video a little while back about important mine breakpoints, and I'll link that video in the description below. But the important thing you need to know for this build is that getting 2% CDR somewhere can improve the number of instant mine detonations you get from 4.3 up to 5. Now, this only takes effect once you've fully qualitied and leveled your automation and detonate mines gem, so it's not urgent, but the moment you do it, it's going to feel really good. Now, you don't have to worry too much about overthrow with this build, but watch the mine breakpoints video and keep an eye on the number of mines you have active. Things like expert sabotage are huge for damage, but if you stack a ton of them and you have a lot of mine throwing speed, they can affect your overthrow. The last thing I'd like to cover are the Bloodline Ascendencies. Now, these look kind of nuts. There are ways you can invest massively into heralds, like say Herald of Purity for a huge physical damage multiplier. There are also a number of defensive oriented ones. Maybe you could trade Spellbreaker for something more defensive or Polymath for something more defensive. There are a lot of options. None of them are really obvious layups to me right now, but I'm going to think about it some more and probably put out a Bloodline Ascendancy update, and we'll talk about it some over opening weekend. If you have any ideas, I'm open to suggestions. I've been so focused on making this video, I haven't had a lot of extra time to spend on theory crafting. Alright, that's all I've got for the League Start guide. It went a little longer than I expected, but there's just kind of a lot of content to cover, and I want to make sure you had as comprehensive a resource as I could provide you. I'm going to be streaming some opening weekend. Feel free to come stop by, twitchtv.ferostembo, or there's also a link to the Discord in the description below if you have any questions or get stuck. There are lots of really helpful people around. I hope you have a great League Start, and I'll see you on the beach.